Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to Sciences Po. Today is June 22nd, 2023, 14 hours, 2 p.m. in Paris. We launched this event, which we call Economic and Social Challenges in the Digital Age. This is a joint event with Georgetown University and McCourt Institute and CPR, Center for Economic Policy Research. This is an event which will take the whole afternoon and early evening. I will show you the program of the event. The program is actually composed in several parts. We will start with a keynote speech by Matt Gensko, professor of economics from Stanford. Then we'll have 3 talks by Ekaterina Zhuravskaya, Julia Cagé, and Nate Persily. Initially, as you may remember, we had Andrea Pratt, who was supposed to come and give a talk. Unfortunately, for health reasons, he can't come, and we are very grateful to Julia who stepped in. And we will later have a policy panel discussion at 6 p.m. We'll have coffee breaks after Matt Gensko's speech and after the 3 research talks, and we'll have a cocktail after the policy panel discussion. I'm saying that for people online. For people offline, I would like to mention that here in the campus, if you see people doing yoga, this is because we have what we call Santoma, the event dedicated to well-being of employees of Sciences Po. Annual event celebrating the fact that Sciences Po is a good place to be. We distribute free ice cream. We also today welcome Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Gutierrez. So if you see higher security, that's not because of Matt, and that's not because of Paul Nimitz. It's because of Gutierrez. Whatever economic and social challenges we are discussing today, it's not the heightened security because of this. So without further ado, I would like to give floor to Matt, and we will take questions during the talk and after the talk. We have about an hour for the keynote, and please don't hesitate to, for people online, please don't hesitate to ask questions online. We will communicate those to Matt. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sergey, so much. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here as part of this event. I wanted to talk about some broad research agenda that I've been working on related to addiction to social media and digital devices. It's joint work with a number of colleagues in different combinations, Chantal Kat, Peter Maxted, Carl Mayer, and Lena Song. And the kind of, I think, broad way to set the stage for this work is thinking about smartphones and social media as innovations. If you kind of think about different ways to scale the impact of innovations on society, you can think about measuring their welfare impact in different ways. One way to think about it is how they've changed the way we use time. To what extent has some change or some innovation really changed the day-to-day, minute-to-minute experience of our lives? And I think it's hard to think of other innovations since maybe television that have had such a big effect. And I think it's good to remember from an economic point of view that at baseline, we might think if there's some new technology that is so good and so enjoyable that people want to spend 2, 3, 4 hours a day using it, that would represent large benefits to society and to people. And I think it's important to keep in focus as we discuss all of this, that those benefits are still very real, or at least potentially very real, and we need to think about that. But obviously, in recent years, a lot of the conversation has shifted to ways that these benefits may not be as large as we think, or there may be harms associated with these technologies. And today we'll talk about different parts of that. I think there's one part of that conversation which is about democracy and politics and misinformation, and really about externalities associated with use of these technologies, ways that what I do with my phone on social media might spill over and impact others in society. I'm going to set that aside for now and talk about the other side of the coin, which is to what extent people are optimizing their own experiences efficiently or accurately. To what extent is the way that people are using these technologies really in their own best interest? And so that part of the conversation has also really grown, and a lot of it is centered around this question of whether there's something addictive about social media and digital devices. So there's been lots of discussion, lots of worry, lots of concern. I think relatively little clear evidence or precision on what we mean when we talk about addiction in this context. What does it mean for a technology to be addictive as opposed to just something that people really enjoy and want to spend a lot of time using? So, you know, as one of pieces of motivating evidence for these studies, these are the results just from a simple survey we did where we asked people across a bunch of different activities, to what extent do people themselves perceive that they might not be using it in the way that they want to be or would ideally like to be. We asked people, do you think you do this too much, too little, the right amount? And here we've just ranked activities by to what extent the actual amount people do things differs from what they would ideally like to do. In some cases, there are things people think they do too much. In some cases, there are things people think they do too little of, but you see that social media, smartphone use rank very high in this scale, similar to things like exercise, saving, eating unhealthy food, and so on. So one of the things that's distinctive in this domain is that people themselves have this really strong perception that they're not happy with their own experiences, and that there's something that they think could be made better. Okay, so the research I want to talk about today spans a couple of papers. There's a paper on digital addiction, which was published a year ago and is now completed, which I'll talk through some of the results from that project. And then I'll talk about some newer work in progress, thinking more about how we can design better self-control tools to help people address these kind of addictive properties that these technologies may have. Both of these are based on a field experiment that we did with users of smartphones, which I'll describe in some detail. Okay, so that first paper asks first, I mean, even before the questions that are on the slide, really, that paper asks, how can we, first of all, define what we mean by addiction in this context? Second, can we measure the extent of that addiction? And third, can we quantify how that impacts the amount of time that people are spending, have some quantitative sense of how much of the minutes that we all spend on our smartphones are due to addiction or due to the mistakes that people are making. Okay, so that's the outline of what I want to talk about. People should feel free to interrupt if they have questions. I'll also leave some time so that we can discuss all of this.
So thank you. Michael Cassagna from Brussels. I have a problem with your metric, because if you define no addiction, perfect self-control with I don't drink too much alcohol, I don't smoke too many cigarettes, and so on, I wonder about the validity of the measure itself.
Can you say more? So I don't think I've proposed a metric yet. You
started with this evidence.
Yeah, so this is just motivating evidence.
Perfect self-control seems to be alcohol, work, cigarettes. That's weird, no?
Well, these are, so this is meant to be just suggestive evidence to say, what are people's own perceptions of the extent to which their behavior is aligned with what they themselves perceive to be ideal. And so that is not to say that there aren't addictive qualities to, say, drinking alcohol. This isn't a measure of addiction. What it is a measure of to what extent people themselves feel that there's a gap between what they're doing and what they would ideally like to do. So I think in this survey, for what it's worth, it is not the case for alcohol that most people have the perception that they would like to drink less or more than they actually do. Most people on the survey say, I'm happy with the amount of alcohol that I drink. I think for cigarettes, this is in the US, where smoking rates are very, very low. Very few people smoke, and the majority of people are happy with the amount that they're smoking cigarettes. Whereas other things like exercise and eating and so on are things that people themselves have a strong perception. But this is just motivation. You don't need to believe anything from that. I will tell you more about how we actually measure addiction in this context. Yeah, thank you for your question. Okay, so I'm going to talk through the design of this experiment. I'll talk through the results from the first paper, and then I'll talk through the work that we've been doing in this second paper. So to look at this, we started with a sample of about 2,000 smartphone users who we recruited on social media using Facebook ads. The whole study is going to be focused on Android users because iPhones have some limitations, kind of, maybe for the better. iPhones have privacy limitations that make it harder to do kind of measurement and so on those devices. So we're going to focus on Android users, and the experiment is going to be built around an app that we designed with the incredibly exciting name Phone Dashboard. We did not end up making a lot of money from the creation of this app, but it was useful for the experiment. It's going to allow us to do two things. First, just measure people's usage of their phones, what apps they're spending time on, and also allow us to give people the opportunity to set limits and control their usage in different ways, and to kind of give us fine-grained control over that. So there are two main randomized treatments in the experiment, which I'll talk about in detail in a minute. One is a bonus treatment where some users are randomized into making money for reducing their minutes of social media use. And the second treatment is offering a subset of users access to limit functionality on this app that lets them, if they want to, set limits on their own usage and use their phones less. There's also a set of survey outcomes that we measure at the end that you can think of as giving an overall sense of people's subjective well-being, how happy they are with their own use of their smartphones, and also some qualitative scales that measure addiction more in the way that addiction tends to be measured in other literatures, like in psychology and medicine. The typical way to think about measuring addiction is using scales that have been validated with questions, people's own perceptions of different kinds of behaviors. So we're going to bring in some of those as well. We also elicit people's willingness to pay to have these bonus and limits, which gives us some additional sources of identification. And we ask people to make predictions of their future use to get a sense of how well calibrated people's expectations are about their own behavior in the future. So all of this work is going to focus on a group of apps, which I'm going to call FITSB in the slides. That's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Snapchat, browsers, where that Chrome icon stands in for browsers, and YouTube. We don't have TikTok here because this experiment was just before the real takeoff of usage of TikTok. And so we were trying to, based on preliminary data, we wanted to collect a set of apps that both account for most of the minutes of usage and also the things that people tend to report wishing that they use differently than they actually do. And browsers here, by the way, stand in for one of the things we realized is if we try to limit usage of, say, the Facebook app and pay people to reduce their usage of the Facebook app, they can easily substitute to using Facebook in a browser. And so the browsers are included here in part just to limit that kind of substitution, but we just include all minutes on browsers as part of that. This is what the app looks like. So it's sort of like screen time on an iPhone. It records usage of different apps, and then it lets you set limits if you want to each day, 1 day in advance. So you can choose for any given app a number of minutes that you give yourself as a limit. I'll talk more about how we use that treatment. And then there's also a kind of maybe more unusual functionality that we included here that's relevant to the second paper, where we're talking about design of commitment devices, where we wanted to vary how hard those limits are. So at one extreme, the limit is completely hard. You can't override it at all. If you gave yourself 60 minutes to use Facebook and you've used it for 60 minutes, you're done, you have to stop, there's nothing you can do. At the other extreme, it's completely soft, just like screen time on an iPhone. You set a limit, you get to the end of 60 minutes. If you want to, you can just give yourself more time. What I'm illustrating here is we also included these intermediate degrees of hardness that we called snoozing the limit with delay. So in those treatments or in those conditions, you could give yourself more time, but you had to wait some number of minutes before you could continue. So there's like a 2-minute delay, a 5-minute delay, a 20-minute delay before you could keep using the extra minutes. And I'll talk more about what we did with that. Julia, I think we need a mic.
I was just wondering, for the app, you put it on a single device. So basically, if you get this message on your iPhone, you can still move to the iPad. You have no way to follow the different kind of users.
Yeah. So we tried to limit the sample to people who say they use one phone primarily, but one of the limitations that I'll talk about more that we talk about in the paper is we don't have good measurement beyond that. We have measurement of substitution within that device, and we have some self-reported measures of substitution across devices, but we don't have anything beyond that. I think the truth is for something like the bonus treatment and the incentives, a lot of usage of social media is on mobile devices and is very often at times where people don't have other devices nearby. So I don't think that kind of substitution is easy, but there definitely is some of it for sure. And that's an important consideration to keep in mind. Okay, so this was the kind of structure of the experiment. I don't want to talk about, I won't go through all of this in a lot of detail, but there were a series of surveys with a period in the middle here after survey 2, which is when the randomization took place. So people filled out a baseline survey, they were recruited into the study. They then had to go away, come back to fill out a second survey. And it was on that second survey that the randomization happens. We did that in part to make sure that people, it's really important for us, the validity of a study like this, that attrition be low and that people who start finish. And in order to get people who were likely to drop out to do that, we made them go away and then come back. So by the time people come back on survey 2, we can have some confidence they're going to stick around and finish the experiment. So then on survey 2, they're randomized in a 2-dimensional factorial design into the bonus and also into this limit. And don't worry about too much the details. I'll talk about that more. There are then 2 further surveys, and we followed people until July 26th. And it's a little important for the results. These periods that I've numbered here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, are each periods of 3 weeks long. So the important thing to remember is the randomization happens just before period 2. And then we have periods 3, 4, and 5 where we follow people after that. And we also had text message surveys separate from these main surveys where we asked people to respond kind of in the moment to questions like, how do you feel right now about the way you're using your phone? Okay, so this is just descriptive statistics of the sample for the experiment. It's not perfectly representative of the US population, as you might expect, given that we're recruiting people on social media. It's oversampling more educated people, oversampling younger people, and to some extent oversampling women. It's relatively representative on income and race. And to get a sense, the last 2 rows in this table show that the typical person in this sample, as measured by the passive measurement that we have on their devices, is using their phones for a total of 330 minutes per day. That's like 5.5 hours. And using that set of Fitsby apps for about half of that time. So 2 hours and a half spent using that set of social media apps. So those numbers are a little bit higher than the overall population average, as you would expect, but not wildly higher. People do, in fact, use their phones a lot. Okay, so just quickly to flag that there are many more caveats that I'm sure all of you can recognize, but some of the important ones here. First, everything I'm going to show you is effects and results local to the sample of people who select into this experiment. And obviously selecting into this experiment is a fairly involved thing. And so that's far from a random sample of people. There's the point that Julia mentioned about substitution to use on other devices, which we can't perfectly capture. A third thing that's really important is this is, like many of the experiments in this literature, it's a partial equilibrium experiment in the sense that we are changing one person's behavior, keeping everybody else's behavior constant. And that's really important for social media, where by construction, a lot of the nature of it, the value of it depends on what other people are doing. So an experiment where we get you and everyone you know to reduce social media use at the same time could be very different than you reducing your social media use while everybody else continues doing it in the same way. And final caveat is this, this was in 2020, the experiment, so it overlaps with the COVID period. We do some stuff on the surveys to try to get sense from people for how things might be different, but that's obviously an unusual period in the world, and we're measuring things in that context. Okay. Any other questions just about the setup of the experiment? Yeah, Inga.
Thank you. I have a question from the people who are following online. There are quite a few. And so the question is from Thomas B, who is asking, is self-perception of tech use an adequate metric of the impact of tech? Others suggest that total factor productivity is the best measure of the impact of tech innovation on the macroeconomy. For example, Nordhaus, Yale Nobel laureate economist, suggests that it is rebutting Eric Brynjolfsson. Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much. Claims that tech innovation has created a fourth industrial revolution. Then there is Gordon's book on the significantly greater relative impact of turn of the 20th century tech inventions versus recent tech innovation. Overall, isn't it a lot of just measuring exaggerated bubbles, fads, and hype?
That's good. It's one of the nice things about questions online is that you can write a lot. So great question. So I think that again is a good chance to just kind of emphasize the scope of what we're talking about here. So as I said at the beginning, there are many different social impacts of smartphones and social media that we care about, including externalities, broader impacts on democracy, and broader impacts on things like the macroeconomy. None of that is part of what I'm talking about today. So what I'm talking about today is specifically the impact of your usage of your phone on your own individual welfare. Which I think, so all of those debates, all of those issues are really important, but they're not what we're talking about here. And again, we will not use people's self-perceptions as the metric for addiction. I'll talk about how we're going to measure that. Okay, so in the first paper, as I said, we want to answer these questions. We want to provide a definition of addiction. We want to ask, to what extent are people in fact addicted by that definition, and then roll that up into some quantitative estimate of how much it impacts time use. I'm not going to talk about all the details of this paper, but the key pieces of it are a model of consumption that's going to provide this definition of what we mean by addiction, descriptive evidence from the experiment on the extent of habit formation and temptation, which is I'll talk about are key pieces, and then we'll use the experimental moments, the experimental results to quantify, estimate that model, and thereby provide some estimates of what is the overall quantitative importance of these addictive factors in driving smartphone use. So I'm not going to go through the model here today, but I just want to give a kind of quick conceptual overview, because this is really where we pin down what do we mean when we talk about addiction in this context. I think one of the things that's a little bit frustrating in the broader debate about this topic is the notion of what is meant by addiction is very loose. And in a lot of cases, I think we end up just equating addictive with really appealing or really attractive, or giving people content that they really want to watch, so they end up spending a lot of hours watching it. None of those things is necessarily the same as addictive. So we're going to build on the literature in behavioral economics. And also, I think this is going to be consistent with broader literature in other fields to define addiction as the combination of two key things. And this is building on models that people have used to talk about addiction to cigarettes and heroin and gambling and other kinds of things. So those two key things are, first, what I'll call habit formation. You could use different terms for that, but that basically means if I use more of something today, it increases my demand for using it tomorrow. So if I take more heroin today, my demand for heroin is going to be higher tomorrow. If I smoke more cigarettes today, my demand for cigarettes is going to be higher tomorrow. So we want to ask whether using more social media today increases demand in the future. That on its own is, you could think of as addiction, but you could also think of as there are a lot of other reasons why you might have habit formation that might not be problematic or necessarily have anything wrong with them. So the other key element where there's a real mistake relative to people's own maximization of utility is what we'll call temptation, which means that the amount that I use something myself in the present moment when I'm making the decision is different from what I would ideally like myself to do from a longer run perspective. So if I ask someone today, how many cigarettes do you want to smoke tomorrow? That might be different than the number of cigarettes they actually smoke when tomorrow comes. Or I ask somebody, how much junk food do you want to eat tomorrow? That could be different than how much they'll actually eat when tomorrow comes. So that temptation, that time inconsistency where people have kind of different versions of themselves that are disagreeing a little bit, and that in the present moment, you're tempted to consume more, is the other key element. So we're going to put those two pieces together, and it's the intersection, the combination, that is what we'll mean by addiction. Yeah, Ruben. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm trying to understand here, just fixing ideas. So your idea here is more that I spend 2 hours instead of 1. So this displays time from other activities, potentially more productive. Are you also in this experiment? Are you also going to be able to study more the distraction aspect? Like I'm trying to do some work, but it's not that much that I spend more time on Facebook, but it's this constant notification that just breaks my rhythm. And so I become less productive. I'm guessing that you have the exact time they spend on this app. So you can even distinguish between long interruption, which is more the switch, versus short interruption, which is just the distraction. I'm not sure this is part of what.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's not something that we're going to be able to get at very directly, but I think it's really important. We do have the data to look at it. And I think that the way we're going to approach it is to, particularly in this first paper, to say the temptation is going to be measured by overall, not necessarily in one stretch, but just overall during the day. Is the quantity of time you spend different than the quantity of time you'd ideally like to spend? We're not going to measure impacts on distraction per se, or impacts via distraction per se, but we will have these kind of survey questions that pick up some elements of that. I think in the second paper, where we're going to look more at the minute-to-minute data and the exact patterns of how people use, I think you could definitely get at that, at least to see whether there's some association between different patterns of use and different perceptions. But I think it's also something for future work to really think about isolating that distraction effect. And there's some part of that that may have nothing to do with addiction. There's some part of that which may just be, people use their thing exactly as they want to, but it has the negative consequence of shortening their attention span and so on in the long run. So that could really be a different, separate dimension. Okay, great. So the goal here is to pick up these two key pieces. We're going to do that using these two key treatments in the experiment. The first is the bonus treatment, where this is like what we actually told people. So if you're randomized into this treatment, we pay you $50 per hour that you reduce your mean use of these Fitsby apps relative to your baseline use. The baseline use is measured earlier before people know that any of this is coming. And that $50 per hour price means that you're going to have an incentive to reduce your usage. This is the key way that we're going to measure habit formation. As you think about it, if I pay you to reduce your usage now, I can then look and see whether after I stop paying you, that has a persistent effect on your usage, and use that to pick up habit formation. That's going to be the key treatment that does this. Importantly, we announced this before period 2, and there are 3 weeks when you know it's coming, but it's not yet in force. That means we can also look at some anticipatory effects that have played a role in the literature on this, whether people reduce their usage in advance when they know that something like this is coming. The other is this limit treatment, which if you're randomized into this, we don't pay you anything. This at least does not involve paying you anything. And we don't give you any incentives to use these commitment devices. We just give you the opportunity. So we say this phone dashboard app allows you to set limits if you want, and we give you some encouragement to go try that out, but then we leave people on their own to decide whether to set limits or not. So we announce this in period 2, and then they have it available for the rest of the experiment. So let me show you the key treatment effects of those two things. These are the treatment effects of the bonus on minutes of use of the Fitsby apps altogether in these different periods. So remember that we tell you about the bonus before period 2, but it's not in force in period 2. Period 3 is the one where we're paying you. So in period 3, you're paid $50 an hour to reduce your use. Then in periods 4 and 5, you're not paid anything. So the period 4 and 5 effects are what are going to identify this habit formation. So the plot is showing here point estimates of treatment effects. So all of these negative numbers mean you're reducing usage. It's in units of minutes. So like minus 60 here means you reduced your usage by an hour per day on average. And the bars around the point estimates are 95% confidence intervals. Yes. 60-minute, say that again. No. So the question was, is there an integer problem where you only get paid if you tick over this 60-minute threshold? It's per minute. So it's it varies smoothly with how much you reduce your usage. But it just so happens, so there's no mechanical reason why the actual reduction would be close to 60 minutes. It just so happens that we're paying people $50 per 60-minute on average, and the average reduction is about an hour per day in period 3. So what do you see? You see a little anticipatory effect. There's a little reduction in period 2, a big reduction in period 3 when the incentives are in force. And then the key thing for habit formation is after we're not paying people anymore, they continue to use less to the tune of about 20 minutes per day in the following 3 weeks. And that gradually decays. So in weeks 4 through 6, they're reducing their usage by about 15 minutes per day. So that's the effect of the first treatment. This is just to illustrate that the limits people set are in fact quite binding. So this is how much you would reduce your usage if you followed all the limits that you set. And so a lot of people are setting limits that are binding relative to their baseline usage. So that's kind of the first measure that these limits, when people are in the limit treatment, they're using them. There's demand. People want to limit their own usage. That by itself kind of tells you that something is not perfectly rational about this behavior. And then the right 4 points here show the effects of the limit. So the left 4 points are just what I already showed you, kind of condensed, the effect of the bonus treatment. And the right 4 points show the effect of the limit treatment. So you can see there 2 things. First, it has a significant effect, reducing usage by about 20 minutes per day. And second, it's quite persistent. So there's no sense that people do this and then stop using the limits. It doesn't decay dramatically. It continues to have an effect. We can then look at effects on these survey outcomes. I'll just show you the set of things we look at very quickly here. So everything is going to be signed so that positive numbers mean better outcomes. The first is, to what extent do you feel like you use your phone too much? So positive numbers on this ideal use change variable mean there's less of a gap between your actual and ideal usage. We have an addiction scale, which is borrowed from the medical / psychology literature that just asks a bunch of questions about your perceived addictive qualities of your usage. We have a similar thing that we measure using these SMS text message questions that ask you things like, did you use your phone right before going to bed yesterday? Kind of thing. Does your phone make your life better or worse? And then a subjective well-being scale. And this shows treatment effects on those things for both the bonus and the limit treatment. The index at the bottom is the average of those. These are measured in standard deviations. So the overall summary is that both of these treatments substantially increase the extent to which people feel like their phone use is aligned with their own welfare. It makes them less likely to describe their behaviors in ways that would be classified as addiction. And it increases the alignment between their actual usage and what they say they would ideally want. So putting that stuff together, I think, what could you learn from this first paper? We offer a definition. We then show, I think the experiment provides very clear evidence that both habit formation and temptation play a substantial role here. That, by our definition, implies that there is addiction. Consistent with that, encouraging people in these different ways to reduce their usage pushes them toward more positive measures on these survey outcomes. And then I don't have time here to go through the structural part of the analysis, but when we put all of the experimental stuff back into the model and estimate the model, the implication is that if you were to turn off the temptation part, i.e. make people's choices aligned with correct maximization of their own utility, that people would use about 30% less time on their smartphones on these Fitsby apps per day, which amounts to about 45 minutes less on these Fitsby apps. So it's not to say that we wouldn't use our phones at all if we were optimizing correctly and there was no addiction, but a substantial portion, something like a third, can be attributed to addiction. So that's the first part. I now want to talk about this more recent work in progress, which is the paper is called Flexibility Through Delay. And what we really want to think about here is, can we dig in more exactly to this kind of minute-to-minute patterns in the data to understand better what it tells us about how to design self-control tools that will be effective in letting people address these issues. We start from this situation where people themselves say they want to fix this problem. If you give them the opportunity, they take that up and they set these limits that has a real impact on their behavior. So there's a real opportunity here to allow people to help themselves. We want to think about how to do that more effectively. Obviously, the market has provided a bunch of potential solutions to this kind of problem. So there are, as you probably know, there's the screen time functionality built into iPhones. There's an analogous functionality built into Android phones. There are also a number of individual apps like Facebook and Instagram provide their own sort of limiting things you can use. Not many people do, but if you wanted to, you could use them. And there are third-party apps, like Freedom is an app that's kind of marketed as reducing distraction and helping you. If you want to, like, say at work, you're not allowed to look at the news, you can do that. Bark is an example of like a parental control app that's providing limiting functions. But the key thing we want to zero in on here is the thing that I was mentioning in the design of these limits, the question of whether limits that people set are going to be hard or soft. And so I think a really notable thing is that what Apple and Google have decided to build into their products, it's kind of notable that they're building anything into their products. I think that's interesting, and it tells you something about their maybe having some well-aligned or better aligned long-run incentive to have people's usage of their products not be entirely detrimental to those people's well-being. But it's interesting that what they build into their products are entirely soft limits. So if I set a limit for myself on screen time and I get to the end of the limit, there's just a button I can push to say, give myself more time. That, as we'll see in the experiment, is not all that effective. It's better than nothing, but as you would expect, it's not super effective. But there's a challenge, because at the other extreme, suppose screen time limits were completely inflexible and hard, there's a different problem there, which is a lack of flexibility. So unexpected things happen, circumstances change, you end up missing your flight and you're sitting at the airport for 3 hours and you want to watch a movie on YouTube, or you forgot that your kid's birthday is being live streamed on Facebook. All kinds of things could happen where, in fact, in the moment, what you planned or the limit you set doesn't align with what you want to do, and you need some flexibility to respond to that. So a completely hard, inflexible limit is not ideal otherwise. And so you could start thinking about different ways to make limits partially hard. How could you create a spectrum? One obvious way to an economist would be to have some cost, something like a monetary cost of relaxing limits. And some of these, like what Freedom does, is kind of a version of that. They don't actually charge you money to relax your limit, but if you set a limit on Freedom, you can opt to have it be such that in order to relax it, you have to like call tech support, sit on the phone with tech support for like a while, which is, it's not a monetary cost, but it's like a time cost, right? It's real economic resources being chewed up in providing yourself with some flexibility. So that kind of thing could work. These delays that I told you about, we're going to kind of propose as an alternative to that and think about what role they could play. So all of that is to say, in designing limiting functionalities, there is a trade-off between commitment and flexibility. You want to allow people to commit. You also want to allow flexibility when the stakes are high. And so these agents, people who are subject to temptation, want to commit to reduce their consumption, but they also face uncertain shocks. And so the two kind of categories of flexibility that we're going to think about in this project are, on the one hand, flexibility through costs, something like monetary or hassle costs, and the other is flexibility through delay, what we built into this experiment, where there's no cost to relaxing the limit, but you're not allowed to keep using it, to use the extra minutes you give yourself until 2 minutes in the future, 5 minutes in the future, 20 minutes in the future. Why might that be a good idea? Because it's motivated by all of the psychological evidence we have on the way temptation works, which is that temptation has some kind of short duration, where eating cake right now feels very different from eating cake 20 minutes from now. And we're going to try to exploit that idea. So flexibility through delay intuitively is going to tend to be an efficient solution, an efficient way to give flexibility when the duration of that temptation is kind of short. So I can get a big bang for the buck, big bang for the cost or delay for something with relatively short delays, where I just make you wait a couple minutes. Even waiting a couple of minutes, that sort of temptation dissipates. And we think this is an interesting idea, not only in the smartphone setting, but in other settings where we're thinking about commitment and temptation. Okay, so we're going to build on the same experiment. Here we have a very different kind of model, where we're not going to be modeling just the overall amount that you use each day, but the real minute-to-minute decisions about each minute, how much you use. Show descriptive evidence on how these delays played out, and does it look like they might be working in an effective way. And then the structural part of this paper is still somewhat in progress. So I'm again not going to talk about that, but I'll kind of give you a hint of what we're up to there. Okay, so the model for this paper is a dynamic model of these minute-to-minute consumption decisions, as I said. So prior to today, the long-run version of myself might choose to set some limits. Then today comes, and there are realizations of the actual marginal utility of consumption, depending on what's happening and whether I missed my flight and whether there's a birthday and so on. In each of those minutes, depending on those realizations, I can choose how much to consume of social media time. And then if I hit my limit, I have a choice of whether to relax that limit or not. And so depending on how long the delay is, or depending on what the cost is, I'll weigh the value of that extra consumption against the cost I have to pay, or against the cost of having to wait. And so importantly, remember I said the intuition here is this delay thing is going to work well if temptation decays pretty quickly. So in this model, we're going to allow the way that temptation dissipates in the future to be flexible. And we're going to estimate that. One of the key things we're going to try to estimate in this is how quickly does that decay? Is consuming in 3 minutes just as tempting as consuming right now? Is it much less tempting? Is 5 minutes different, 20 minutes different, an hour different, and so on? Yeah. Yeah, good question. So the question was whether this is what we're thinking about here is overall use of your phone or specific apps. So the model is general and could be any of those, and could also, you could think of a version of the model applying separately to different apps. In the empirical work, we're going to again focus on this Fitsby set of apps, since that's what we were kind of encouraging people to set limits on. So we see all of the apps in the data. We can look at data patterns for all apps, but those are the ones we're going to focus on, and we're going to interpret for the structural estimation here. We're going to think of the choice as consuming those apps or not. Yes, we also know what other apps people are using that are not those 5. So we monitor everything, all of the apps that are used on their phone. We can't see what people do inside those apps, but we can see which app basically is in the foreground every minute of the day. So that's a good segue. This is an example of what the raw data look like here, with the caveat that here I'm only plotting use of those Fitsby apps. So I'm not plotting all the other apps if people are using email or maps or music or other things. So this is for a particular user. Each kind of column here is one day, and the colors indicate different apps that they're using. You can see this is, I would say, like a pretty typical user. We didn't pick, an extreme case here. It confirms that people use their phone a lot. And you can also see that this interesting fact, consistent with what we were talking about distraction, that a lot of the usage is this kind of staccato, picking up your phone, looking at it, putting it down, picking up your phone, looking at it, putting it down. It's not sitting down to watch a movie for 2 hours for the most part. You also notice something that you see to a remarkable degree in this data, which is how much people use their phones in the middle of the night. There's an awful lot of that kind of behavior too. Okay, so let me just show you some of this descriptive evidence, and then I'll wrap up and you can see if there are more questions. So I'm going to show you a few pieces. First, evidence on how people set limits in the experiment. I already showed you that they set binding limits. What I want you to think about now is how would the limits that people set vary with this delay, or with how hard the limits are. So if you're thinking about setting limits on yourself tomorrow, how is that going to be different if I tell you you can freely relax the limits if you hit them, or they're going to be really hard and you can't relax them later? Intuitively, and also through the lens of the model, the harder the limits, the looser the limits you're going to want to set on yourself. So if there's no flexibility, you're going to tend to want to give yourself more buffer. If there's a lot of flexibility, you might as well set really tight limits. So the first prediction of the model is that the tightness of the limits will vary. And we see, I would say, like a hint of that in the data. So if you just compare delay 0 here means the completely soft limit. There's no delay. You can just give yourself more time. The average limit tightness, which here means if you followed the limit, how much would you be reducing your usage relative to the baseline, is about 54, 53 minutes. Whereas in the no flexibility condition at the other extreme, where you can't relax it at all, people are setting limits that are about 10 minutes less tight. So there's some clear slope here, although it's a little bit noisy given the sample size. If you reboot your phone, it doesn't help, but everybody has the option to actually delete the app and opt out of the experiment. So the app will start in the background if you reboot your phone and continue enforcing the limits, but there is a way to, obviously we can't, deleted it. No, relatively few people did that. The overall attrition in this experiment was very, very low. We had 98% of people continue with the app installed. Remember that anybody can always choose not to set any limits, right? These limits are entirely at your discretion. So the only way you would want to do this is if you were in this no flexibility condition and you had set a limit on yourself, and then you had some kind of emergency where you just desperately had to use Facebook. And then you might uninstall the app. Yeah, so the flexibility is not a choice. The flexibility is randomized. So we randomized equal numbers of people into these different groups. So the question was how many people choose no flexibility or delay 0. I'll show you in a sec what people say they would choose if we gave them the choice, but this was assigned to them, not something that they could choose in the experiment. Okay. And this is like a little bit of how that limit tightness evolved over time. So you can see there's an overall pattern toward people kind of falling off the wagon and making their limits looser and looser over time. So they're kind of it's sort of like people start on a new diet and they are really strict about it at the beginning, and there's a little bit of evolution toward doing it less, but that's really just in the first week or so that mainly happens. And then after that, it's relatively constant, although in the no flexibility case, there's maybe more decay over time. These little spikes are the surveys. The points where it spikes up are points where where they had the surveys, and we gave them a little, again, encouragement to, remember you could go set these limits if you want to. Okay, so second question, how does the relaxation of the limits vary across these delay conditions? So intuitively, the longer the delay, the less that people should be relaxing the limit. I think part of what's interesting is how does that compare across these different delays? Do you really need longer delays in order to deter relaxation, or does even a 2-minute delay deter a lot of that and make a big difference? So these are those results showing two things. First, the number of limit extensions per day, and second, the number of minutes of extension per day. That's just two different ways to look at things. What you see is there's a downward slope, meaning as expected, the longer the delay, the less people relax the limits. Remember, in the no flexibility condition, they can't relax them at all. So I'm just showing 0, 2, 5, and 20. But what I think is, I really want to draw your attention to here is the biggest gap is just between 0 and 2. So even this 2-minute delay gets you almost all the way there in terms of the reduction in the extent to which people give themselves more time. So this is, I think, probably the strongest evidence in the descriptive results for this idea that even just a little bit of delay can make a big difference in the degree of commitment. This is how limit relaxation evolves over time. So it's kind of a similar story. There's an overall increase in how much people are giving themselves more time as they're kind of falling off the wagon a little bit again. That happens mostly at the beginning and then stabilizes. And it stabilizes at a point where this gap between 0 and 2 is really large, as you can see. Finally, how does all that stack up? So people are, if you make the limits tighter, people are setting weaker limits, but they're sticking to them more. That could go either way on net, right? It could be that the softer limits are most effective in reducing usage. It could be that the harder limits are most effective in reducing usage, depending on how those two things trade off. It turns out that that having some hardness in the limit makes a big difference. Increasing by about 50% how much people are reducing in minutes. So if you just compare delay 0 to delay 2, there's a big difference. But between delay 2 and no flexibility, it's pretty similar. So again, the message is just that 2-minute delay is getting you most of the way there, or a lot of the way there in terms of the limit, in terms of the reduction in usage that this creates. Okay, so I'll basically wrap up there. We also can look at how the effects on these survey outcomes differ across the delay treatments, and the general picture there, consistent with what I showed you about the reduction in minutes, is the survey outcomes get better the harder the limits that people had. So people feel better when they have these harder limits that are causing them to reduce their usage by more. And if we ask people to the question, like, what would people choose? If we ask people what they would like, so at the end of the experiment, we offer them the opportunity to pay something to keep Phone Dashboard installed. Again, this is where our entrepreneurial venture was not especially successful. We did not make a ton of money from this, but it gives us a measure of how much people are willing to pay. And at the time we asked them, hey, by the way, if you were to have it installed, what would you ideally like the delay to be? And you can see, sort of interesting, there's a set of people who say, I don't care. There are a set of people who say, I just want the soft limits. And then within the remaining group, the modal response is something like 5 minutes. So there's some significant demand for these short delays. Okay, so let me skip over the structural estimation. I'm not going to show you the model anyway, but just I want to kind of illustrate preliminary results that we can estimate these decay functions of temptation. So this is just a kind of illustrative example, still very much work in progress, of what these results imply for the way that temptation decays over time. Because the 2-minute delay has a big impact, we estimate a big drop in temptation over 2 minutes, but then it's relatively flat thereafter. So there's also a kind of within day temptation, which remains pretty strong. Okay. So to conclude, the model tells us that when temptation is big and it decays fast, that this delay may be a good way to design commitment devices with intermediate degrees of flexibility and commitment. The empirical evidence suggests that you get a big bang for the buck with even a little short 2-minute delay, suggesting a lot of decay of temptation over short time horizons. So let me stop there, and we have time for some more questions. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Mikhail. Thank you very much, Matt. That was very clear and very, very interesting. I have a question regarding the relationship of those issues you were talking about to incentives of the platforms themselves. The business model is actually to keep your attention. These delays or whatever other tools to limit your time use of those applications is going against that. You mentioned that some of these platforms add anti-addiction devices, sometimes soft. If you think about self-regulation or the need for government regulation on this, how do we think devices like this, tools like this would be compatible with what platforms want to do or what we can force them to want to do?
Yeah, this is a super important question, and I'm really glad you asked it. A couple of things I think are true. First, the answer really differs depending on what platform we're talking about in interesting ways. So if you compare a company like Meta to a company like Apple, the extent to which they make money from kind of minute-to-minute engagement is quite different. Both of them have some incentive to keep you engaged and keep you using things, but for Meta on Facebook and Instagram, there's a huge incentive, which is also very much reflected in their behavior, to just maximize short-run engagement. And that's been a huge part of what those platforms have done. And perhaps not coincidentally, they really have not made, I think, any serious efforts to provide ways for users or parents or anybody else to limit that time. I mean, it may be unfair to say they haven't tried at all. They have introduced some things, and I think they are attentive to some of these issues, but in the spectrum of things, they're not doing that much. Apple, at the other extreme, that makes money mainly by selling devices, you might think has at least more incentive to care about the long-run welfare or longer-run welfare of their users. Like what is going to be good for Apple is that people who buy iPhones, you know, a month later or 6 months later or a year later, feel good about having bought an iPhone. And if an iPhone is like junk food, you buy it, you can't help yourself, you spend 9 hours binging on terrible stuff and you feel sick afterwards, that's not great for Apple's business model. So I think in relative terms, at least, companies that a company like Apple making devices might have more incentive. Now, the really interesting thing is, where do those incentives fall relative to socially optimal, and what could we do to strengthen them? I'm skeptical that those incentives are ever going to be strong enough, even for Apple. I think that, you know, more pressure on those companies, more awareness from those companies is good. But as I said, I think the thing that's at least somewhat optimistic here is there's just a lot of demand from users themselves. And I think, you know, we can already see some response to that demand, and I hope, you know, that there's more that could be done with that. There's certainly scope for regulation. If I think it's challenging to craft that well, but if there are regulatory solutions that can strengthen those incentives to give good tools to users, I think that's definitely valuable. Great.
So thank you very much. It was fascinating. One thing which is still strange in these graphs, if it's an alpha beta model of self-control, what you're pointing at is all the flesh is in the first minute or two. But then when you measure addiction, which I guess is closer to a measure of welfare, that's fairly continuous. Mm-hmm. So first, if you were to regulate, which measure would you use? And second, why the gap?
Yeah, when you say it's fairly continuous, you're thinking of these addiction measures?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So I think it's really interesting. And that a couple of things to say. One is, notice the confidence intervals here are pretty big. So there's a clear monotonicity. I don't think you could rule out that the pattern here is similar to the pattern in the other plots. I think the you know, ideal use change here is really based on how much minutes changed. And if you look at those points and compare them to these points, they're quite aligned, I think. But I agree there's some tension here, and you know, it would be really nice if you saw, or it would be at least nice in the sense of being consistent, if you saw a very clear pattern where, you know, something like this, where the difference between 0 and 2 is very clear so that everything aligns. We don't really see that. So I think based on the evidence here, there's reason to hope at least and to think that these short delays make a difference through the lens of our model. The answer is going to be that they do, but these survey questions and also these things, I mean, we would have loved to see people themselves say, 2 minutes is really great and is what I want. And we don't see that either. So, you know, there are some tensions here, and I think more work is needed to sort all of that out.
It's okay. Yeah. So Matt, I'm going back a little bit to my previous question. So here I was wondering, it would be really interesting to understand whether people reaction to the notification that they hit the limit depends on what activities they were engaging before. From introspection, the most dangerous ones are type of use of apps that gives you the illusion that you're actually working, but you're not, like emailing and browsing and so on and so forth. For social media, I would expect most people, not everybody, but most people to be pretty clear that it's entertainment / wasting your time and so on. But if you're engaging in things like you're browsing and you're looking for information, or you're emailing compulsively and you think like, oh, I'm working, of course I'm going to snooze this because I'm going to continue working and so on. Your data seems like ideal, I guess, to study those sort of interaction and gives us hints about, you know, maybe modifying these tools depending on what people are doing, and, you know, just a suggestion.
Yeah, that's great. I totally agree. So we do show how the limits people set vary across apps, and we can in principle do everything we're doing here separately by app. I don't think in this experiment we have the sample size to really be able to do that, but I think one could easily extend this to do the same thing with a larger sample. I think that kind of, I think it's really, really important in this whole conversation that we not lump together YouTube and TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and all these things as if they're somehow the same. They're incredibly different, and the lumping together that I'm very guilty of here is solely just based on limited power. But I think that's really important. One other just detail I would say, there's like a slightly different version of that, which is important too, which is there may be a kind of state dependence in consumption that means limits can be costly for reasons other than, it can be both effective and costly for reasons other than temptation. So like if I'm watching a movie, you know, and it's 20 minutes from the end, you know, a 20-minute delay may be particularly costly. And so there's also understanding better the state dependence patterns in consumption as well as serial correlation that we're also would like to work on. Yeah, you grab a microphone.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I know that the survey was only in the US, but it would be interesting to see how these patterns of self-control vary by culture, because I imagine that they would. And also within a country, in a society, the socioeconomic proximates, I think also matter for addiction. So.
Yeah. Great question. So the second thing we can do, we do look at a bunch of different dimensions of heterogeneity across things like income and race and gender and age. And the broad picture is surprisingly little differences. So like we thought age, for example, might be a real standout here, but in fact, young people and older people look quite similar in their overall level of apparent addiction here. The thing about across countries, I totally agree. I think it'd be really interesting, both because cultural factors influence things and because the kind of apps and the way people are using social media varies to some extent country to country. So would love to look at that. And again, you know, we don't have the data to do it here, but it would be a direct, easy extension of this to do that.
We also have 2 questions online. So the first one is from Bersad Diba, who's asking, can you elaborate on how you word your communication with participants and any concerns about the wording?
For the wording of our communication with participants, I would refer you to the paper, where the appendix has all of the surveys and all of the details of that. I think, we did our best to try to make things very clear. That's always challenging in survey design. I had some co-authors here who are good at that because I'm not myself. But I think, yeah, it's probably best to leave that to what's in the paper and online. Yeah, good. So a specific, and maybe that's partly what we're getting at, a specific question here is, are we kind of leading people in a particular direction? And I put at the front the caveat about sample selection. I think that's important and there's no way to get away from that. To the extent that we could, we tried to keep everything very neutral. The recruitment, we did not recruit people by saying, hey, do you think you're using your phone too much? Come join our experiment. The recruitment was very just like join a study about the internet, kind of very general. And we did survey people afterwards about what they thought the intent or the goals of the experiment was. And there was no clear systematic pattern, people saying they thought we were anti or pro use of phones.
Thank you. And then the next question is, social media is also a source of information for younger people. Are there some estimates on awareness about current events given the limitations? Do people optimize their time of Feedsby or look for relevant info, or do they switch to other media, or are they less informed?
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. So we don't, for the reasons I said, we're not focusing on information here. In other work that we have done and also work that other people have done, we have good estimates of that. And the answer is yes, like people really do get information. And so if you take people off of social media, contrary to some of the narrative about misinformation, when people are off of social media, they really are less informed about current events. They know less of what's going on. And I think an underappreciated thing is the role that these platforms play in providing political information, particularly to people who otherwise get very, very little of it. The overwhelming fact about news consumption, both in the US and increasingly in other countries, is just people get very little news, period. And a lot of people are exposed to it through these apps. In terms of substitution, yes, we can look at that too. I think there's very little evidence of substitution toward other news sources. So there's very little you can see of people actively seeking out alternative sources of news and information. There is also strikingly little substitution even just to other social media, but there's some of that in some cases. All right, thank you.